Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 20th century, so sit back as we go to Wales. Amy Stuart was born on the 24th of August 1893 in the town of Sunderland in the northeast of England. She was one of 3 children, born to James and Jane Stuart, a hard-working and respectable couple who were considered fine and upstanding members of the local community, so it may have seemed strange when Amy was just 15 years old. Her parents gave their consent for her to join a touring dance troupe, named the Magnets. Amy had always shown a great talent for dancing and had an ambition to one day perform in the great theatres in London's West End. Many people were surprised that her parents agreed to this, as in the early 20th century, there were those who thought that this was not a virtuous occupation for a young lady. However, things were changing in Britain. Queen Victoria had died in 1901, and the country had now entered the Edwardian era. Amy adopted the name Mamie, and after touring with the Magnets, she formed her own dance troupe, which she named the 5 Verona Girls. For a while the troupe were very popular and performed all over the country. They entertained soldiers who had returned from the battlefields of World War I, but after one member of the troupe became pregnant and another broke her ankle, the 5 Verona Girls disbanded. She then returned to her parents' house in Sunderland. She was now 23 years old and considered to be an attractive young lady. She had brown, bobbed hair, a style that was starting to become very fashionable. She was around 5 foot 3 inches tall, had blue eyes and perfectly straight teeth. However, one of her teeth was missing. The war continued in Europe and daylight bombing raids had taken place over London. In February of 1917, the government had introduced bread rationing and the Women's Land Army had been formed. This was a British civilian organisation created by the Board of Agriculture that encouraged women to work on farms, replacing the men who were fighting on the battlefields of Europe. It was in Sunderland where in 1917, Mamie, as she now insisted she was known as, met Mr. George Shotton, an elegant and charming gentleman in his late 30s who worked as a marine engineer, and that as his work was very important in the war effort, he travelled all over the country. They started a relationship which soon became quite intense, and after just a few months, George proposed. Within a year of their first meeting, Mamie Stuart and George Shotton were married in the town of South Shields, very close to Sunderland. Following the wedding, George was sent to work in Bristol, a city some 240 miles from Mamie's hometown. However, the couple did not stay there for very long and soon moved on to Wales. They settled in the city of Swansea, staying in lodgings in Trafalgar Terrace. Then in the summer of 1919, they moved to the area of Caswell Bay, where they rented a small cottage. As Mamie had previously spent long periods travelling with the dance troupe, she had become accustomed to writing letters and would regularly write to family and friends who still lived in Sunderland. Although Caswell Bay was beautiful, it was quite remote, and Mamie found it difficult to adjust to living in somewhere so secluded. George would still go away for work, which meant that she would be left alone in the cottage, and when he returned, they would often argue. He would accuse her of seeing other men, and the arguments frequently ended up by George beating his wife. Mamie certainly no longer believed that her husband was a charming gentleman that she had met in Sunderland. In the letters that she wrote to her mother, she suggested that her marriage to George was not as she had hoped it would be. In one she wrote, "He hit me on the head. I was sick," and he went on laughing. "I don't think I will live with him very long." In another letter, she informed her mother that if she was ever unable to contact her, she should speak to Mrs. Hearn, who was the landlady when she first moved to Swansea. Mrs. Stuart continued to write to her daughter, but in mid-November 1919, a letter was returned with the words, "House closed," written upon it. Mrs. Stuart thought that there must have been a mistake, so sent a reply-paid telegram to Mamie. This too was returned. By now Mrs. Stuart had become quite concerned, but her worries were put to rest when in the December she received a telegram that had supposedly been sent by Mamie. In the telegram, she wished her parents a Merry Christmas. Then, all communication from her daughter stopped. In March 1920, The manager of the Grosvenor Hotel in Swansea contacted the police, as a leather trunk had been left there since December the previous year and had not been reclaimed. There was no label, so the manager did not know to whom the trunk belonged, only that his staff had told him that it had been left there by a gentleman. The police opened it. Inside were women's clothes and shoes, and a piece of paper with the address of Mr. and Mrs. Stuart in Sunderland. Detectives contacted the Stuarts, who told them that the items belonged to their daughter, but they had not had any word from her since a telegram they had received just before Christmas. Mrs. Stuart gave the detectives the letters that her daughter had written to her. In them, Mamie had described her husband's jealousy and his violent behaviour. She had also written that she had feared for her own safety. About the same time, a damp brown leather handbag was found behind a dresser by a maid who was cleaning the cottage that George and Mamie had previously occupied. The handbag contained £2 in change and a sugar ration card with the name of Miss Amy Stuart. The police believed that Mamie Stuart was dead. They contacted Scotland Yard in London, who sent Chief Inspector William Draper to oversee the investigation. Mamie's description was sent to police stations across the country, and her picture was printed in the newspapers. But despite this, no one came forward with any news as to her whereabouts. The Chief Inspector ordered that a meticulous search should be undertaken in the cottage where Mamie and her husband had lived. The search was not only of the property, also of the grounds and the surrounding area, but it failed to find any trace of Miss Stuart. The focus of detectives then turned to the missing young lady's husband, Mr. George Shotton. The letters Mamie had written to her mother described a jealous, controlling and violent man, and it was soon revealed that when George married Mamie, he already had a wife and a son named Arthur. Mamie had written in her letters that there were periods when she was alone in the house, as George had to work away, but police believed that during this time, he was not in fact working away. He was just living with his wife and son in the town of Penarth. He was interviewed by detectives, but said that he had never married Miss Stuart, and although he had lived with her for a short time, they had never actually been married. He also denied that he had ever been violent towards her. He told the officers that one day she just packed some clothes and left him. He said that following this, he took the trunk with her things and left it in the Grosvenor Hotel in Swansea. The case was causing some difficulties for the detectives, because at the time, it was not possible to charge a person for murder without first having a body. Mr. Shotton could also not be charged just because Miss Stuart had disappeared. The investigators started to refer to the case as the perfect crime. The only thing for which the officers were able to charge him was bigamy, and in July 1920, he stood trial in Swansea. He pleaded not guilty. Mr. Shotton's wife, Mrs. Mary Shotton, gave evidence and confirmed that she had been married to the defendant since 1905. Miss Stuart's sister, Mrs. Edith Brass, informed the court that Mr. Shotton had stayed at her parents' house in the summer of 1918 after marrying her sister. The prosecution also produced letters written by Mr. Shotton, which he had addressed to Miss Stuart, referring to her as his wife, along with a signed marriage certificate. Mr. George Shotton, however, continued to deny that he had ever married Mamie Stuart and claimed that the signature on the marriage certificate was not in fact his. He did not deny that he had spent the night of the 25th of March 1918, the date of the supposed bigamous marriage with Mamie, at a hotel, and since that day he had lived with her in Liverpool, Bristol and Swansea. Somewhat inevitably, Mr. George Shotton was found guilty of bigamy and sentenced to 18 months in prison with hard labour. He was released in 1922, following which his wife divorced him, but still, no one had heard from Mamie Stuart, and no body had ever been found. The disappearance of Miss Mamie Stuart had been reported extensively in the newspapers, and over the next few years, the story continued to be covered, as there were reported sightings of the missing young lady from as far away as Canada, South Africa, Australia and India. One gentleman, named Mr. Thomas James, who was a chief officer of a steamer and a friend of Miss Stuart's father, said that he had seen her and that she was part of a troupe of travelling artists performing in Karachi. He spoke to her, but she denied that she was Mamie Stuart and quickly walked away. Mr. James, however, was convinced that she was indeed the missing young lady. Following his release from prison, Mr. George Shotton had moved to the small village of Tintern on the west bank of the River Wye, which is close to the Welsh border with England. Here he was a regular churchgoer and ran the local tennis club. Over the next few years, he established himself as a well-liked and charming member of the local community. However, this came to an abrupt end when a local newspaper reported about the case of the missing Mamie Stuart and her bigamist husband. George quickly left and relocated to Balham in South London, where he lived with his elderly mother and found employment in a number of low-paying jobs. He was arrested in May 1938 for threatening his sister named Miss Gladys Austin. He had told her that he would shoot her with a revolver, apparently due to an argument over their mother's will. He was then charged, and at the subsequent trial, sentenced to 12 months in prison. He was released in 1939 and cut off all contact with his family. He left London and eventually settled in Bristol. Apart from the odd alleged sighting, there had still been no confirmation as what had happened to Mamie Stuart, and as the years passed, the case became somewhat forgotten. In 1950, the cottage where George and Mamie had lived in 1919 was sold, and the new owner undertook extensive drainage work around the property. Workers came across a woman's shoe in a pit which stretched underneath the house. The pit had been filled with quicklime. However, despite extensive searching, nothing else was found. On the 5th of November 1961, 3 young men, named Graham Jones, John Girk and Colin McNamara, went to explore a disused lead mine at Brandy Cove in Caswell Bay on the Gower Peninsula in South Wales. When they were about 50 metres down, they made a gruesome discovery. Laying behind a rock, in a narrow chamber, was a human skull. Next to it was a sack. They looked inside and found it contained what looked like human bones. There were also some rings, a hair clip, and the remains of what they thought to be clothing. The men contacted the police, and over the next few days, the bones were recovered and a difficult forensic search conducted. The discovery had been made just 200 yards from the house that Mamie and George had shared over 40 years earlier. Pathologists confirmed that the bones were of a young woman, probably in her early 20s, who would have been about 5'3" to 5'4" inches tall. It was not possible to determine the cause of death, but pathologists were unable to discount strangulation or stabbing. They did report that the body had been cut into multiple pieces. An inquest was held, which began on the 14th of December 1961. The skeleton was laid out in the courtroom throughout the proceedings. Evidence was heard from many witnesses. One, named Elsie May Evans, who had been a good friend of Miss Stuart during World War I and who had also worked as a showgirl, told the inquest that the rings found to belong to Mamie. She said that Mamie always wore her engagement ring and that she could remember it well. It was also confirmed that the rings were produced between 1912 and 1918, which was consistent with the timeline when Mamie would have been given them by George. The skull had a missing tooth, the same tooth that Mamie had lost when she was a girl. A retired postman named William Simmons claimed that in December 1919 he had seen Mr. George Shotton carrying a large sack. He said that he offered to help, and a startled George looked up and said, "No, no, no. Oh God, you gave me a fright. For a minute I thought that you were a policeman." Mr. Shotton then loaded the sack in his van and drove off in the direction of Brandy Cove. When asked why he hadn't reported this at the time, he replied that he did not think that the two matters were connected. The coroner's jury ruled that the skeleton was that of the missing Miss Mamie Stuart and that she had been murdered, probably by her husband. The police then set out trying to locate Mr. George Shotton. They discovered that Mrs. Mary Shotton had remarried and was still living in Swansea, but she did not know her ex-husband's whereabouts. George Shotton was eventually traced to a retirement home in Bristol, but he had died following a stroke on the 30th of April 1958 and had been buried in an unmarked grave in Arnos Vale. Police could only find where his body lay, as it was marked with his welfare number. The police believed that Mr. George Shotton had got away with murder. Following the excitement in the press at the discovery of the whereabouts of Miss Mamie Stuart, the interest soon waned when it was known that George Shotton was deceased. and once again, the case became largely forgotten. No effort was made to lay Mamie to rest, and instead her skeleton was kept in a cupboard at Cardiff University, where it was sometimes used to assist in teaching students. It was not until December 2019 that the skeleton was returned to Sunderland. This was after Mrs. Susan Oldnell, who was a great niece of Mamie Stuart, was approached by researchers who were making a television show based on unsolved murders and informed her as to the whereabouts of her great-aunt's skeleton. Mamie Stuart was then buried alongside her parents in the Bishop Wearmouth Cemetery. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case